A millionaire hires a nanny for his sick son. He installs a surveillance camera and is shocked to discover her secret. The late afternoon sun cast a soft, golden glow over the city, but the warmth stopped at the tall windows of William's office. Inside he stood rigid, staring out at the streets below. His thoughts, however, were miles away, circling around memories of Selina. The laughter, the light she brought to their lives before it was all taken away. He closed his eyes, exhaling sharply, as if trying to push the past back into its cage. A faint cough from down the hall snapped him into the present. Amber's cough. William turned, his hand brushing the edge of his desk, knuckles whitening as the sound lingered. He hated the helplessness that came with it. The knowledge that no matter how much money or effort he threw into doctors and treatments, Amber's frailty was a constant reminder of his failure to protect what mattered most. In the living room, Amber was curled up under a blanket, his wide, pale eyes watching a nature documentary. He smiled at William when their gazes met, but it was a tired, apologetic smile, one that struck harder than words ever could. Nearby, the temporary nanny fumbled with the inhaler, her nervousness only amplifying William's frustration. Another one who wouldn't last. Returning to his office, William reached for the black folder on his desk, flipping through the resumes it contained. The candidates blurred together, polished credentials, rehearsed references, and carefully curated photos. Then he stopped. Keisha Adams. Her picture caught his attention. There was nothing rehearsed about her expression, just a genuine warmth that seemed to leap off the page. He hesitated, rereading her experience with children who had special needs, her years as a pediatric nurse. "Amber needs stability, Mr. Garrett," Margaret had said that morning, her tone gentle but firm. "You need someone who'll stay." William frowned, the weight of the statement hanging heavy. Stability. A permanent solution. Yet the idea of entrusting Amber's care to someone else felt like handing over his heart. The next morning, the interview began. Keisha entered the room with an air of quiet confidence, her demeanor steady but unassuming. William, seated at the head of the table, scrutinized her as she walked in, every movement, every detail. She didn't falter under his gaze. Her dark eyes met his directly, calm but without challenge. "Your resume is extensive," William said, his tone clipped. "But experience isn't the same as commitment. What makes you think you're the right fit for my son?" Keisha paused briefly, her composure unshaken. "Because I understand that caring for a child like Amber isn't just a job. It's a promise," she replied. Her voice was firm, but there was a quiet empathy that made William sit back slightly. "I've worked with families where love and fear often go hand in hand. I know what it means to show up every day for as long as it takes." The words caught him off guard. Most applicants would have jumped to tout their qualifications, eager to impress. Instead, her quiet confidence intrigued him. "Tell me about your most recent role," William asked, leaning back in his leather chair, his sharp gaze fixed on her. Keisha hesitated just a moment, then spoke with measured clarity. "I cared for a young boy named Michael for 3 years. He had cystic fibrosis. Those years were challenging but deeply meaningful. Sadly, he passed away 6 months ago." Her voice faltered slightly, and William noticed the flicker of grief in her eyes. "After that, I took some time to process the loss before deciding I was ready to return to caregiving." William's voice dropped an octave, curiosity tinged with skepticism. "And what makes you think you're ready for another demanding case like my son's?" "Because loss taught me empathy, not fear," she replied, her tone steady but warm. "Your son needs someone who knows that caring is about more than administering treatments or following routines. It's about building trust, showing compassion, and being present in the moments that matter." William rose from his chair and moved toward the window, his silhouette framed by the light streaming in. His tone was serious, almost curt. "Ms. Adams, I won't sugarcoat this. This position requires more than just professional expertise. The house is outfitted with security cameras, and your privacy will be limited. Many find it intrusive." Keisha met his words with calm understanding. "I can appreciate your need to ensure your son's safety, Mr. Garrett. If I were in your position, I'd likely do the same." She paused, then added, "But I hope, over time, you'll come to see that trust isn't built through surveillance. It's earned through actions." William turned sharply, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized her. "Are you questioning my methods, Miss Adams?" "No, sir," she said firmly, her gaze unwavering. "I'm simply being truthful, as I promised I would at the start of this conversation." The room fell into a heavy silence, the kind that makes time seem to stretch. From the doorway, William's assistant, Margaret Lane, watched with bated breath. In all her years of working for him, she had never seen anyone address her boss so directly, yet without a hint of disrespect. After a moment, William's voice softened, almost surprising himself. "Would you like to meet Amber?" Keisha nodded, her smile returning. On the 4th floor of the sprawling estate, Amber was finishing his physiotherapy session. His sandy blonde hair stuck to his forehead, and his pale blue eyes sparkled as his father entered the room. But it wasn't William who held the boy's attention. It was Keisha. "You must be Amber," she said warmly, kneeling to his level. "I hear you're a big fan of ocean documentaries." Amber's face lit up. "Do you like them too?" he asked, his voice raspy but filled with curiosity. "I love them," Keisha replied. "Did you know that humpback whales create new songs every year?" Amber giggled, a rare sound that made William freeze in place. He hadn't heard that kind of laugh from his son in weeks. For the next hour, Keisha chatted with Amber about coral reefs, deep-sea creatures, and her volunteer work at a local aquarium. Seamlessly, she worked breathing exercises into the conversation, making them feel like a game instead of a chore. William stood back, observing her with growing admiration. As Keisha stepped out to fetch some water, Amber called out to his father, "Dad, she's not like the others." William nodded slowly, his voice thoughtful. "No, she's not." Later that night, back in his study, William reviewed Keisha's contract one more time. Margaret entered quietly, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. "The other candidates are still waiting, sir," she said cautiously. Without looking up, he replied, "Cancel the rest of the interviews." Margaret blinked in surprise. "You're certain? She was awfully candid during the interview." "That's precisely why," William said, setting the signed contract aside. "Amber needs someone who's not afraid to speak the truth, even when it means standing up to me." That evening, as William checked the security footage, a nightly ritual, he paused on a clip of Keisha talking to Amber. The way she engaged with his son was a rare blend of professionalism and genuine care. His phone buzzed with a message from Richard, his lawyer. "Contract signed and returned. Ms. Adams begins tomorrow at 7 a.m. William glanced at a framed photo of his late wife, Selina, on his desk. Her bright smile and gentle eyes seemed to watch him. "What would you think of her, Katie?" he murmured into the quiet room. A memory came unbidden, Selina's voice ringing in his mind. "The eyes never lie, William." And Keisha Adams' eyes told a truth he couldn't ignore. For the first time in years, he felt the faint stirrings of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he had found someone who could bring light not only into Amber's life, but into the home that had felt cloaked in shadows for far too long. The morning sun crept through a light mist that blanketed the gardens of the Garrett estate. At precisely 7 o'clock, Keisha arrived at the front door, carrying a modest bag and a brightly wrapped package under her arm. Margaret met her in the foyer, her heels clicking sharply on the polished wood floors. "Mr. Garrett is on a video call," Margaret said, her tone brisk but not unkind as she led Keisha upstairs. "He left specific instructions regarding Amber's care. The schedule, medications, and emergency contacts are in his room." Stopping in front of a door adorned with glow-in-the-dark stars, Margaret hesitated before turning the knob. "Miss Adams," she began quietly, "Amber had a rough night. These temperature changes always upset his breathing." Keisha gave a calm nod. "May I see his overnight records? That will help me understand his patterns," she replied. Margaret handed her the folder, impressed by her focus and preparedness. Inside the softly lit room, Amber stirred restlessly in his bed. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor punctuated the quiet. Keisha moved with practiced ease, scanning the readings before crouching near the bed. "Good morning, little explorer," she whispered. Slowly, Amber's eyes fluttered open, a faint but genuine smile spreading across his pale face. "You really came," he said hoarsely. "Of course I did, and I brought you something special." She placed the package in his hands. Amber unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small constellation projector. His eyes widened in wonder. "Wow, it's like having the stars right here in my room." Keisha smiled. "We can create our own starry sky tonight. But first, let's focus on getting you some breakfast to build your strength." Downstairs, William Garrett sat in his study, his eyes fixed on the surveillance monitors. On one screen, Keisha's easy, natural way with Amber caught his attention. She wove his breathing exercises into playful stories and coaxed him into taking his medication without resistance. Her presence, both gentle and firm, intrigued him. Later, Keisha joined Amber at the kitchen table, where a bowl of colorful soup sat steaming before him. William entered, his sharp eyes immediately noticing the change. "What kind of soup is that?" he asked, his brow lifting skeptically. Keisha, unperturbed, looked up. "It's my own recipe," she said. "Rich in nutrients, low in sodium, completely within his dietary needs. The key is fresh herbs." Amber grinned and raised his spoon toward his father. "Try it, Dad. It doesn't taste like medicine. It's magic." William hesitated before accepting the offer. The spoonful surprised him. It was genuinely good. "Ms. Adams," he said, his tone firm but measured, "can we talk privately?" In his office, William closed the door and crossed his arms. "I appreciate your initiative, but any changes to Amber's diet must be cleared with me first." Keisha met his gaze, unflinching. "With all respect, Mr. Garrett, this recipe adheres to all medical guidelines. I even have the nutritional breakdown here." She handed him a meticulously detailed sheet. "I've noticed Amber is hesitant with meals. Making food enjoyable could be part of his recovery." William scanned the paper, searching for errors but found none. He nodded curtly. "What else?" "Amber mentioned wanting to see the garden," Keisha added. "A few minutes in the morning sun could be beneficial for his health." "No," William replied flatly. "The outside air can boost his immune system under controlled conditions," Keisha interjected smoothly. "Isolating him completely won't protect him forever." A tense silence followed. William's jaw tightened as he grappled with her logic. Finally, he relented. "1 week," he said. "Show me measurable results and I'll consider it." That evening, after Amber had gone to bed, Keisha sorted through her notes. Among them, she found a drawing Amber had made. 3 stick figures, one tall, one small, and one medium-sized, stood under a star-filled sky, all smiling. She added a brief note and left it on William's desk. Mr. Garrett, Amber has a heart bigger than this house and dreams larger than his limitations. Today he talked about how much he'd love to see the stars for real. Sometimes the greatest form of protection involves taking small, calculated risks. Respectfully, Keisha Adams. The next morning William stared at the drawing and her note. Selina's words echoed faintly in his mind. Love without freedom is a gilded cage, my love. For the first time in years, he wondered if his fear of losing Amber was keeping the boy from truly living. Later, watching Keisha adjust the star projector in Amber's room, creating a magical universe on the ceiling, William saw his son laugh, a carefree, joyful sound he hadn't heard in years. It was then William began to consider that perhaps, just perhaps, letting go of his rigid control might allow Amber and himself to breathe a little freer. As William stood by the monitor, watching his son from afar, a change in Amber caught his attention. Despite his frail health, Amber seemed stronger, his laughter coming more freely even as he faced the same daily challenges. It was a small yet striking difference, enough to make William linger a moment longer before turning back to his work. That morning, a clear and crisp one, William cancelled a high-stakes meeting after spotting something alarming on the screen. Amber's breathing had become erratic. William rushed to his son's room, his heart pounding with urgency, only to find Keisha already there, calm and in control. "Breathe with me, Captain," she said softly, settling behind Amber on the bed. Her tone was firm but soothing, a steady anchor in the midst of the storm. "Remember the story about the diver? We're going to the surface, nice and slow." Amber, trembling but trusting, matched her breaths, his small hands clutching at her arms for reassurance. William hesitated in the doorway, feeling like an outsider in his own house. He watched silently as Keisha continued, her voice weaving a tapestry of calm around his son. "Okay, now tell me 3 things you can see," she encouraged. Amber's wide eyes darted around the room. The star projector," he whispered. "My ocean book and Mom's picture." William felt a pang as he glanced at the photograph Amber mentioned. It was Selina, forever smiling from the frame on the bedside table, her warmth captured in an eternal moment. His throat tightened as Amber answered Keisha's next prompts. "2 things you can touch?" she asked gently. "My blanket," Amber said, his voice steadier. "And your necklace." Keisha smiled as Amber reached for the small anchor pendant around her neck, holding it as though it could tether him to safety. "And something you can smell?" Keisha asked. Amber closed his eyes for a moment, a faint smile breaking through the strain. "The chamomile tea you make." Bit by bit, the crisis passed. Amber's breathing slowed, his small frame relaxing against Keisha. When he finally drifted into an exhausted sleep, Keisha tucked him in with quiet care, smoothing the blanket over him like a mother might. As she turned, she nearly jumped at the sight of William standing there. "Mr. Riley," she said quickly, "I didn't realize you were here." William didn't respond immediately, his gaze shifting from Keisha to his sleeping son. "How long have you been using that technique?" he asked at last, his voice low. "The anchoring technique," Keisha replied, "since the 2nd week. It helps keep him grounded during an episode, gives him something to focus on." William ran a hand through his hair, an uncharacteristically vulnerable gesture. "Why didn't I know about this?" Keisha hesitated, then spoke softly. "It's in the daily reports I send you, page 3, paragraph 2 of last week's report." He remembered the report vaguely, one of many documents he'd barely glanced at in the rush of mergers and deals. The realization hit hard, a wave of guilt washing over him. "Mr. Riley," Keisha said, breaking the silence, "can I offer a suggestion?" He nodded, still watching Amber's steady breaths. "Amber needs you as much as he needs his treatment," she said gently but firmly. "Your presence makes a difference that no medicine can match." William's immediate response was defensive, though his tone lacked conviction. "I have responsibilities, a company to run." "And you have a son to love," Keisha countered simply. "Let me show you something." She retrieved a folder she'd kept carefully organized and opened it to a series of graphs and notes. "These are Amber's vital sign records. Look at the difference when you're here. During dinner last night, his oxygen levels stayed stable for hours. That's not just a coincidence." William stared at the data, his analytical mind recognizing the undeniable patterns. "Why do you track all this so meticulously?" "Because care isn't just about medications, Mr. Riley," Keisha said quietly. "It's about understanding every part of his life that affects his well-being." That afternoon, for the first time in years, William cancelled his schedule and spent hours with Amber. They talked about whales and oceans, stories Keisha had shared, and Amber's dream of seeing the sea in person one day. In the background, Keisha watched from the monitor room, a faint smile on her lips. Margaret, William's assistant, stepped in beside her, arms crossed as she observed the scene. "It's been years since I've seen him like this," she said softly. "He's so afraid of losing Amber that he's forgotten how to live." Keisha didn't look away from the screen. "Sometimes people just need to see that love and protection aren't opposites," she said simply. On a particularly busy afternoon, while sorting through documents in William's office as he had instructed, Keisha inadvertently brushed against a folder, causing it to tumble to the floor. As she stooped to retrieve the scattered papers, her gaze landed on something that made her pause mid-motion. It was a police report tied to the accident that had claimed Selina's life. Under normal circumstances, Keisha would have quickly returned it to its place without another thought, honoring the boundary of her employer's privacy. But one line on the page caught her eye and refused to let go. "Suspicious circumstances regarding brake system failure." Before she could process what she had seen, a sharp voice broke the silence. "What are you doing?" She flinched, startled by William's sudden appearance in the doorway. His expression was stern, his features locked in a mask of controlled anger. The weight of his glare pinned her in place, the tension in the room palpable. "Please let me explain. I said, get out." His shout echoed through the hall, sharp and unrelenting. Staggered, Keisha stepped back. She had never seen him lose control like this. In the hallway, Amber stood wide-eyed, clutching his blanket. "What's wrong with Dad?" Amber's voice was soft, but edged with concern. Keisha crouched beside him, her face carefully composed despite the storm within her. "It's nothing, sweetheart," she said gently. "Sometimes grown-ups just need a little time to themselves." She guided him back to his room, holding his small hand in hers, even as her mind raced. Later, when Amber was finally asleep, she returned to the hallway. Her eyes fell on a sealed envelope sticking out of her bag. Inside was a check, large enough to silence questions, and a terse note. "Your services are no longer required." For a moment, Keisha's instincts told her to pack up and leave. Instead, she tightened her grip on the note and marched toward William's office. She found him sitting in the dark, a glass of whiskey resting on the desk beside him, half empty. The shadows on his face deepened the exhaustion in his eyes. "You can't fire me," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. William looked up, startled, before his expression hardened again. Excuse me? Amber has an important doctor's appointment tomorrow, she said, stepping forward. Next week, he starts aquatic therapy. And in 3 days, he's been working on his whale project presentation. I'm not abandoning him now. You've crossed every line, William retorted, his tone biting. Keisha straightened her back. No, Mr. Garrett, you've built so many walls, you've forgotten there are people on the other side, including your son. Don't you dare, he began, but she cut him off. Amber asks about his mother every day. Do you know what he wants to know most? Whether she loved him? Because his father never talks about her, never shares memories, never. Enough! William shot to his feet, his glass toppling to the floor. His voice cracked under the weight of emotion. You don't know anything about loss, he shouted. Keisha took a deep breath, her voice soft but firm. I know more than you think. William wasn't the first child I lost, and every loss taught me something. Silence doesn't protect. It suffocates. The room fell into a heavy stillness. William staggered toward the window, his broad shoulders slumping as if the air had been pulled from him. His voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper. It was my fault. Selina wanted to see Amber's recital. I was buried in a merger and told her I'd send the driver. She insisted on going alone, if I'd just gone with her. Or you both could have been lost, Keisha said gently. He turned sharply, his eyes red-rimmed but fierce. The report? He asked, his voice strained. There were suspicions of sabotage, he admitted. Someone inside my company looking to destroy me. Selina died because of me, because someone wanted to hurt me. It wasn't your fault, Keisha said, her voice unwavering. William's jaw tightened. How can you say that? Because I see how you protect Amber, how you would give up everything for him. The man Selina loved couldn't have failed her. She paused, her own words catching up with her. William froze, noticing the slip in her tone. Keisha. She stepped back, suddenly aware of the intensity in his gaze. That was inappropriate, she stammered. Stay, he said, his voice quieter, using her name for the first time. Amber needs you. Keisha's hand hovered over the doorknob before she nodded, her voice steady. And you? She asked softly. Maybe I do too, William admitted. Before the moment could settle, a cry pierced the quiet. Mommy! Amber's voice was a mixture of anguish and longing. Both adults rushed to his room, finding the boy sitting up, tears streaming down his face. Mommy, he sobbed, I dreamt about her. William hesitated, then sat beside his son, pulling him close. Do you want me to tell you about the time she took you to see the dolphins? He asked, his voice warm but tentative. Amber nodded, his tearful eyes brightening slightly. It was the first time William had ever offered such a memory. Keisha quietly turned to leave, but William caught her wrist. Stay, he said, his voice almost pleading. She sat nearby as William spoke. His words were slow, but his tone carried a softness that Keisha had never heard before. Amber fell asleep smiling, clutching his father's sleeve. For the first time, the walls William had so carefully built began to crumble, leaving space for the three of them to breathe. Amber, the relationship between your father and me is purely professional, Keisha said gently, but the warmth in her voice wavered. Still, he smiles differently when you're around, just like in those old photos of him with your mom. Before she could explain further, Margaret appeared at the pool's edge, her heels clicking briskly on the tiles. Miss Adams, Mr. Garrett requests your presence in the office immediately, she announced, her expression unreadable. On her way to the office, Keisha tried to steady her racing heart. When she arrived, William was standing by the window, his broad shoulders tense, his gaze fixed on the sprawling estate below. The taut line of his jaw betrayed his inner turmoil. "We need to set some boundaries," he said, his voice low but controlled, still facing the window. "Mr. Garrett, if this is about, it's about everything," he interrupted, turning abruptly. His dark eyes locked on hers, a mixture of frustration and unease. "It's about how Amber is getting too attached, about how things are changing." Keisha held his gaze, her own expression soft but resolute. "Change isn't always bad. It is when it puts my son's well-being at risk." His voice was sharper now, and he ran a hand through his hair, a telltale sign of his anxiety that Keisha had come to recognize. "Amber has already lost his mother," William continued, his tone quieter but tinged with pain. "I can't let him grow attached to someone who might leave like every other nanny before you." Keisha's response was calm, though there was a quiet defiance in her tone. "And that's safer for who, Mr. Garrett? For Amber, or for you?" The silence that followed was heavy, the weight of unspoken truths filling the room. William finally turned toward his desk, picking up a faded photograph of Selena. His voice softened as he spoke. "Selena and I met in college. She was everything I wasn't, spontaneous, full of life. She used to say I needed to learn how to dance in the rain instead of always trying to build shelters from it." Keisha stepped closer, her voice low. "And she was right, wasn't she? When I lost her," William continued, his voice faltering, "I promised myself I wouldn't let anyone become that important again. I swore I'd protect Amber from feeling that kind of pain." Keisha's words came quietly but firmly. "But you're failing, William. You're failing because love isn't something you can control." She paused, her voice softening. "Your son needs to learn how to love, how to trust, how to connect with others, even if it means taking risks." "Like you?" His question was barely more than a whisper, his vulnerability cutting through the space between them. "Like anyone he chooses to let into his heart," she replied, her voice steady. William closed the distance between them, his eyes searching hers. "And what about me, Keisha? What choices do I have?" Her heart pounded in her chest. "The same choices we all have," she murmured. "To hide behind walls or—" Her voice trailed off as William's hand gently brushed against her cheek, his touch tentative, yet electric. For a brief moment, the world seemed to stop. "Dad? Keisha!" Amber's excited voice shattered the moment, breaking the spell. They stepped apart quickly, like teenagers caught in the act. Amber dashed into the office, his wet hair dripping onto the floor, a triumphant grin lighting up his face. Margaret followed, towel in hand, a mixture of amusement and exasperation in her expression. "Sorry, Mr. Garrett," she said, holding out the towel. "He insisted on showing you his swimming progress." William glanced at Amber, then at Keisha, and finally at the photo of Selena still in his hand. His thoughts churned, the clash of past, present, and future evident in his face. "Amber, you need to dry off and warm up," Keisha said, her professional tone slipping back into place. "Come on, before you catch a cold." As she led Amber out, William's voice stopped her at the door. "Keisha." She paused, but didn't turn around. "Tomorrow night," he said, his voice quiet but deliberate. "After Amber has gone to bed. Can we continue this conversation?" "I'm not sure we should," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please." The unguarded vulnerability in his tone startled her. "We need to figure this out. For Amber," he added, but the words felt like an echo of something deeper. Keisha nodded slowly, her heart heavy with unspoken truths. For Amber, she agreed, though they both knew that wasn't the whole story. Later that night, as William checked the security cameras one last time, he paused on an image of Keisha reading to Amber. The boy was nestled against her, his face glowing with a happiness that had been absent for too long. "What should I do, Selina?" William murmured to the photo of his late wife on his desk. The silence that followed was deafening, fraught with possibilities and fears he wasn't yet ready to name. The conversation William Garrett had planned with Keisha never took place. Instead, an unexpected storm swept through Chicago, bringing pounding rain, howling winds, and an ominous chill that triggered one of the worst respiratory crises young Amber had ever faced. The humid air and sharp drop in temperature turned the night into a desperate fight to stabilize the boy's fragile health. William and Keisha stayed by Amber's side, each grappling with their fears in their own way. Keisha exuded calm precision, her hands steady as she monitored vital signs and administered medication. Across the room, William paced like a restless lion, his phone clutched tightly as he alternated between frantic calls to doctors and stifled moments of despair. "His heart rate is too high," Keisha murmured, her voice barely audible over the steady hum of the medical equipment. She glanced at William, her expression composed but urgent. "We need to calm him down." "I've already called an ambulance," William said, his face pale, his voice tinged with panic. Keisha shook her head firmly. "In this storm, a hospital trip will only make things worse. Trust me." Their eyes met, the room dimly lit by the soft glow of Amber's star projector, casting swirling constellations on the ceiling. Amber lay gasping between them, his small body straining for each breath. "Mr. Garrett," Keisha said gently but firmly, "I need you to sit here, on the bed, with Amber." "What?" William hesitated, confusion flashing in his eyes. "Sit on the bed? Why?" "Please," she urged, her tone soft but insistent. Reluctantly, William obeyed, easing onto the bed and leaning back against the pillows. Keisha moved quickly, positioning Amber against his father's chest. "Now," she said, her voice steady, "breathe with me, slowly and deeply. Amber will feel your rhythm and try to match it." For long, tense minutes they sat together, their breaths falling into sync. Gradually, Amber's frantic gasps eased, his small frame relaxing against William's. The boy's chest rose and fell in a calmer rhythm, his soft voice breaking the silence. "Tell me a story," Amber whispered, his words faint but clear. William froze. Selina had always been the one to tell stories, her voice weaving magic that captivated their son. "It was a stormy night," Keisha began, settling on the edge of the bed. "Much like this one. The sea was wild, and a little boat struggled against the waves." "No," Amber interrupted, his voice gaining strength. "I want Dad to tell it." Panic flickered in William's eyes, but Keisha placed a reassuring hand on his, her touch brief but steady. It was a summer night," William started hesitantly, his voice low. "Your mom and I met in college. She was dancing in the rain on campus, and I thought she'd lost her mind." His words gained momentum, memories rising to the surface as he spoke. Amber's eyes, though heavy with exhaustion, stayed wide with wonder, refusing to close as his father's story unfolded. "She always said life was too short to wait for sunshine," William continued, his voice faltering slightly. "Sometimes you just have to dance in the storm." A loud crack of thunder startled Amber, making him cringe. Instantly, Keisha adjusted the star projector, its soft lights creating the illusion of an underwater world on the walls. "Look, Captain," she whispered, her voice soothing. Even storms can be beautiful when you see them the right way. Amber finally drifted into a peaceful sleep, his breathing steady and regular. William, however, remained motionless, his arms still wrapped protectively around his son. "You can rest now," he said softly to Keisha. "I'll stay with him." "I know you'll stay," she replied, gently tucking the covers around Amber. "But you don't have to stay alone." The quiet was broken only by the sound of rain tapping against the windows. After a long moment, William spoke. "Do you know what else Selina told me that night?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "She said some people are like lighthouses. They don't stop the storm, but they help you find your way through it." Keisha absorbed his words, understanding the deeper meaning behind them. "William," she said softly, a small smile touching her lips. "Sometimes even lighthouses need guidance. That's why they're often paired." Outside, the storm began to ease, but the unspoken emotions between them churned stronger than ever. As Amber murmured in his sleep about stars and oceans, Keisha and William exchanged a glance that neither could name, but both felt deeply. The next morning, Margaret found them in the same spot. Amber lay sound asleep between them, his cheeks pink and peaceful. William and Keisha sat on either side of the bed, their exhaustion evident in the shadows beneath their eyes, but tempered by the quiet understanding between them. "Coffee's ready," Margaret said softly, observing the scene with a knowing smile. "The medical reports you requested have also arrived, Mr. Garrett." "Thank you, Margaret," William replied, his gaze fixed on Keisha. "Cancel my appointments for today. I'll be staying home." Margaret smiled discreetly as she left the room. Some storms, she thought, didn't just bring destruction. They brought renewal. One particularly chilly afternoon, while Amber napped after lunch, William Garrett found Keisha in the library. She was carefully arranging materials for Amber's school project, her movements calm and precise. William stepped inside, shutting the door softly behind him. "We need to talk," he said, his tone deliberate and serious. Keisha straightened, setting aside the folder in her hands. "About Amber," he continued, his voice lowering, "and about us." The weight of his words lingered in the room, unspoken meanings pressing between them. William walked toward the window, his gaze fixed on the frost-tipped trees outside. "Richard discovered something new about Selina's accident," he began, his words heavy. "The sabotage. It wasn't an outside competitor." Keisha paused, her attention now solely on him. "Who was it?" she asked softly, leaving her papers untouched on the table. "It was someone from within," William replied, his voice tight. "Someone I trusted." He turned back to her, his expression shadowed by anger and grief. "Maxwell Bennett. He was our head of security. He confessed to everything yesterday." Keisha's breath caught slightly, her calm composure faltering just enough to show her shock. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice careful. William looked at her directly, his eyes earnest. "Because I need you to understand why I built all these walls, why I filled this house with cameras, why I've made it so hard to trust anyone." He hesitated for a moment, stepping closer. "But you've managed to tear them down." His voice softened as he went on. "With your honesty, your dedication to Amber, and your—" A sudden, muffled cough crackled through the baby monitor. They both turned instinctively toward the door, but the sound soon subsided. Amber had drifted back to sleep. "See?" Keisha said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Not every interruption is an emergency." William let out a soft breath, a faint trace of a smile touching his face. "You've changed everything," he admitted, his tone low but resolute. Amber smiles more now. He talks about the future, and for the first time he's getting to know his mother through the stories you've shared with him. He hesitated, swallowing hard before adding, "Selena always said that real love isn't about holding on so tightly that you suffocate it. It's about letting it grow freely. I never understood that until you showed me." "William," Keisha took a step back, shaking her head slightly. "I'm your employee. I'm here to look after your son. We can't." "Can't?" he asked, his voice soft but unwavering. "Or won't?" The question caught her off guard, and her eyes darted away. "It's not that simple," she murmured. "Why not?" he pressed. She sighed, the answer finally slipping out. "Because I have my own walls." His brow furrowed, but he stayed silent, waiting for her to continue. "William wasn't just a patient I cared for," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He was my brother." The room fell silent, her admission hanging heavy in the air. "For 3 years, I gave him everything I had," she continued, her words steady now. "I gave up relationships, my career, my entire life, just to be there for him. And when he passed—" Her voice faltered, but she quickly steadied herself. "I promised I'd never let myself care that deeply for someone I could lose again." William stepped closer, his movements deliberate but unthreatening. He took her hands in his thumbs brushing lightly over her fingers. "So, we're both cowards," he said softly, his tone almost self-deprecating. "Both trying to protect ourselves." Keisha's lips curved into a faint, bitter-sweet smile. "Amber asked me something yesterday," he continued, his voice quieter now. "He asked if it's wrong to feel happy, even when you still miss someone you've lost." Tears welled in her eyes, and she whispered, "What did you tell him?" "That Selena would be furious if she thought we were honoring her memory by living in sadness," William answered, his voice thick with emotion. At that moment, hurried footsteps approached the library. The door opened and Margaret stepped in, her expression awkward as she hesitated at the threshold. "Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Garrett," she said, glancing between them. "The counsel is waiting on the line." "I'll be there in a moment," William replied, his voice calm, though his gaze lingered on Keisha. Margaret nodded and left. As the door clicked shut, William turned back to her. "Have dinner with me tonight," he said, his words coming out more like a request than a command. "After Amber goes to sleep." Keisha hesitated, the wariness in her eyes returning. "I don't think that's appropriate," she said cautiously. "Not as boss and employee," he clarified. "As William and Keisha." Her defenses wavered, and a small, involuntary smile appeared on her lips. "Amber already knows," he added, a flicker of amusement in his tone. "He told me I was being silly and should just ask you to dinner." Keisha raised a brow. "He said that?" "Word for word." William's smile widened slightly. "So, what do you say?" Before she could answer, Amber's drowsy voice crackled through the monitor. Their gazes turned to the sound, their moment suspended once again. "Dad? Keisha?" Amber's sleepy voice carried through the monitor. Keisha paused, muttering to herself, "Saved by the bell," before heading toward the door. "That's not a no," William called after her, a small smile tugging at his lips. Keisha stopped briefly in the doorway, throwing him a glance. "And it's not a yes either." His smile lingered as she disappeared up the stairs. It followed her like a warm shadow, sending her heart into a rhythm she hadn't felt in years. In Amber's room, the boy was sitting upright, rubbing his eyes. His hair stuck out in unruly curls, and his face still carried the softness of sleep. Keisha sat beside him on the bed. "I had a dream about Mom," Amber said quietly. Her chest tightened, but she kept her tone light. "You did? What happened?" "She was smiling," Amber said, his voice a mix of wonder and sadness. "She said she was happy." Keisha swallowed hard, her hand resting lightly on Amber's blanket. "Did she now?" Amber nodded. "And she told me something. That sometimes you have to be brave to be happy." Keisha turned to the doorway where William now stood. His expression was soft, his usual guarded demeanor replaced with something gentler. Amber caught her attention again, his small voice breaking the silence. "You know something, Keisha? I think Mum was really smart." Keisha smiled faintly. "I think you're right." Amber's eyes darted between her and his father. "So, are you going to have dinner with Dad?" The question caught her off guard, and she couldn't help but laugh. "We'll see, buddy. Now, how about we finish that project on whales you were working on?" Dinner didn't happen that night, but a week later, as the season's first snow fell quietly over Boston. William had planned it with his usual precision. The table on the enclosed veranda was set with soft, warm lights casting a golden glow. A small jazz trio played in the background, and the menu was perfectly chosen, a mix of comfort and sophistication. Keisha arrived promptly at 8, having tucked Amber into bed just moments earlier. She wore a simple navy blue dress that made her eyes shimmer like the night sky. William stood as she entered, pulling out her chair. "I thought you said no," he teased. "I never said no," Keisha replied, smiling. "I just took my time to be sure." "Sure about what?" he asked, pouring wine into their glasses with deliberate care. "That it wouldn't hurt Amber," she said, her tone soft but steady. "And you've made your decision?" William asked, sitting across from her, his gaze curious. Keisha took a sip of wine before pulling a folded piece of paper from her pocket. "Actually, Amber helped me decide." She handed the paper to him. Unfolding it, William found a drawing. 3 figures stood hand in hand beneath a starry sky. In the corner, another figure, surrounded by a golden glow, smiled down on them. He said, "You're our family," Keisha explained gently. "You, him, and me down here. And Selena." Her voice caught briefly before she continued, "Blessing us from above." William stared at the picture for a long moment, his eyes glistening. "He has her gift," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "The ability to see what's truly there, not just what's on the surface." The dinner flowed naturally after that, their conversation weaving between light anecdotes and deeper confessions. They shared memories of their lives before meeting, fears they'd carried, and hopes that had begun to take root. "What I miss most about Selena," William admitted as dessert arrived, "was her ability to find beauty in everything, even in storms." Keisha smiled softly, "Like Amber does." "And like you," William added, reaching across the table to take her hand. "You've brought color back into our lives, Keisha. Do you know that?" Before she could respond, the monitor beeped. Amber's cough followed, faint but urgent. Keisha began to rise. "I'll check on him." "No," William said firmly, placing a hand over hers. "Let me stay and finish your wine." In Amber's room, he found the boy sitting up, silent tears streaming down his cheeks. "Hey, champ," William said gently, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Bad dream?" Amber shook his head. "No. I'm scared." "Of what?" William asked, his brow furrowing. "Of Keisha leaving, like Mum did." William's chest tightened as he pulled his son into his arms. "Listen to me, Amber. Your mum never wanted to leave us. And Keisha, she's not going anywhere." "Promise?" Amber whispered. "I can't promise forever," William admitted. "But I can promise I'll do everything I can to keep her with us. Will that work?" Amber nodded, snuggling closer. "Dad? Yeah? Do you still love Mum?" William kissed the top of his son's head. "Always. She gave me you, the greatest gift of my life." "Then, is it okay to love Keisha too?" William smiled. "Yes, son. The heart has plenty of room for love." When he returned to the veranda, Keisha stood near the railing, watching the snow fall. She held his jacket, forgotten on the chair earlier. "Is Amber okay?" she asked as William approached. "He's fine," he said, taking the jacket and slipping it on. "I just needed some answers." "And did you find them?" William looked at her, his expression soft. "I think we all did." After a moment, he held out his hand. "Keisha, dance with me." Soft music floated through the room as they swayed together. Snow fell quietly beyond the glass, turning the night magical. "Selena would be proud," Keisha whispered against his shoulder. "Of what?" "Of seeing you and Amber live, not just survive." William gently pulled back to look at her. "That's thanks to you." "No, it's thanks to the three of us," Keisha said with a soft smile, her gaze lingering on Amber's drawing spread out on the table. Her eyes then lifted toward William, reflecting gratitude and warmth. Outside, the snow continued to blanket the world in silence, but inside the cozy balcony, something profound was taking root. It wasn't just love. It was a quiet understanding that life's most meaningful blessings often emerge from life's greatest challenges. Even wounded hearts, when given time and care, possess an infinite ability to mend and grow stronger. "Keisha," William murmured, his voice breaking the momentary quiet. "Yes?" she replied, her expression tender. "Thank you for teaching us how to weather the storm," he said, his tone laced with sincerity. Keisha smiled at the memory of their shared struggles. "And thank you for showing me that a lighthouse isn't just a beacon. It can also be a home." As winter's grip began to loosen its hold, the Garrett household faced a new challenge. Amber developed a sudden infection, one serious enough to land him in the hospital for 3 tense days. During those days, William and Keisha rarely left his bedside, though their composure began to falter under the strain. William juggled frantic calls to specialists and moments of heavy silence, while Keisha remained an unwavering presence by Amber's side, her calm focus concealing the exhaustion that tugged at her. On the third night, William found her nodding off in a stiff hospital chair, her head tilted at an uncomfortable angle. "You need to rest," he said, his voice low but firm. "I'm fine," she replied, straightening her posture with effort. "I'd rather stay here." "Why?" he asked softly, his curiosity piercing through her usual composure. Keisha hesitated, her eyes clouding with emotion. "Because that's how I lost William," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "One night I told myself I'd go home and rest. When I came back the next morning, it was too late." Without a word, William crossed the small space between them and pulled her into his arms. For the first time, he let his actions speak louder than the walls he had built around himself. It wasn't a grand gesture, but in that moment, it was everything. Keisha melted into the embrace, whispering, "Amber's not William, and you're not alone this time." Amber, who had been stirring lightly, cracked open an eye and managed a faint smile. "You look like one of those couples in the movies." he murmured sleepily, his voice barely a whisper. Both William and Keisha froze, then stepped back awkwardly. Keisha leaned forward to check on Amber. "How are you feeling, Captain?" she asked, her tone regaining its professional warmth. "Hungry," he croaked, his lips twitching into a grin. "Can I have something that doesn't look like clear slime?" He pointed weakly toward the IV drip. William chuckled, a deep, genuine sound that had been absent for too long. "I'll see what the doctors allow," he replied, ruffling Amber's hair gently. Later, when they were alone, Amber studied Keisha with a surprisingly serious expression. "You love my dad, don't you?" he asked bluntly. The question caught her off guard. "Amber—" "It's okay," he interrupted. "Mum came to me in a dream last night. She said, 'You have a heart as big as the ocean.'" His words were simple, but they struck deep. Tears welled in Keisha's eyes. "Your father and you are very special to me," she said earnestly. "Then why do you pretend you're just the babysitter?" Amber asked, his childlike wisdom disarming her. "Love isn't that complicated. It's like when whales sing, you just let it happen." Before she could respond, William returned with a doctor, bringing long-awaited good news. The infection was subsiding, and Amber could go home the following day. That night, as Amber slept peacefully for the first time in days, William found Keisha sitting in the quiet hospital cafeteria. He slid into the chair beside her, breaking the silence. "The doctors said your work made all the difference," he remarked, his tone soft but full of meaning. "Keeping up the therapy even when the fever was high. It wasn't just professional. It was—" He paused, searching for the right words. "It was like you were fighting for him, the way a mother would." The word hung between them, loaded with meaning. Keisha looked away, but William pressed on. "Keisha," he began, his voice growing steadier, "marry me." Her head snapped toward him, eyes wide with shock. "What?" she breathed. "Marry me," he repeated, kneeling beside her despite the curious stares of others in the room. "Not because Amber needs a mother, and not because I feel alone, but because you've turned our house into a home. You've shown me that it's possible to love deeply more than once in a lifetime, each time in a way that's completely real." Keisha hesitated, her heart warring with her fears. "But what about your fear of losing again?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'll probably always be afraid," he admitted, "but you've shown me some things are worth the risk." "I'm still afraid," William Garrett admitted, his voice low. "I probably always will be. But Selena taught me to dance in the rain, remember? And you've shown me that some dances are worth the risk." Keisha lowered her gaze, her hands resting in her lap. Tears slipped down her cheeks, quiet but steady. "Does Amber know about this?" she asked softly. William's lips curved into a faint smile. "Actually, he's the one who picked out the ring." He reached into his pocket, producing a small velvet box. Inside lay a delicate sapphire ring, framed by tiny diamond stars that sparkled like captured starlight. "He said it had to be blue, like the ocean, because he knows how much it means to you. And the stars," William added, his voice thick with emotion, "are to remind us that there's always light, even on the darkest nights." Keisha's fingers trembled as she stared at the ring. "How long have you been planning this?" she whispered. "Since that night on the balcony," William admitted after a pause. "But these last few days made me realize there's no perfect moment. There are just moments. It's up to us to make them count." Keisha's mind raced. She thought of all the walls she had built to guard her heart, the grief she had buried. She thought of Amber and his innocent, hopeful wisdom, of Selina's quiet blessing in their shared dreams. At last, she found her voice. "Yes," she breathed. Then louder, steadier. "Yes, I'll marry you." William's smile lit up the small cafe, warming it like the first rays of dawn after a long winter. As he slid the ring onto her finger, a soft murmur of applause rippled through the room from the other patrons. Keisha flushed, but couldn't hide her smile. "We seem to have an audience," she teased. "Let them watch," William replied, his hand lifting her chin. "Some stories deserve witnesses." He kissed her, gentle and sure, as if sealing a promise to the future. News of the engagement spread quickly. Margaret, William's trusted assistant, was the first to notice the ring on Keisha's finger when they returned home. Her knowing smile suggested she had expected this for some time. In the following days, Boston's high society buzzed with gossip. The tabloids tried to spin sensational stories about the former nanny becoming the fiancé of the reclusive millionaire. But William and Keisha's unwavering dignity, along with their steadfast focus on Amber's happiness, silenced the harshest critics. One crisp morning, William found Keisha standing in Selina's old bedroom, a space untouched since her passing. Framed photographs lined the walls, and the scent of lavender lingered faintly in the air. "Are you sure you want to do this today?" William asked, his voice softer than usual as he watched her carefully study the room. "Amber deserves to know her," Keisha replied. William stepped closer, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Together, they gazed at the memories captured in the room. The joy, the love, the life that once filled it. "She would have liked you," William said quietly. Keisha tilted her head back to look at him. "How can you be so sure?" "Because you have the same light in your eyes," William answered. "The same drive to make a difference in the world." He paused, inhaling deeply. "Selina always said our purpose is to leave the world better than we found it." Just then, Amber appeared in the doorway, hesitating as though he weren't sure if he should enter. "May I come in?" he asked, shyly. "Of course, sweetheart," Keisha said, extending her hand. Amber stepped inside, his green eyes, so like his mother's, darting around the room. "She liked to collect seashells," William explained, motioning to a shelf filled with delicate specimens. Each one had a story. Amber reached out, picking up a pink shell. "What about this one?" William chuckled softly, a memory tugging at the corners of his mind. "That one? She found it on the beach the first time she felt you move. She swore you were dancing inside her to the rhythm of the waves." Keisha watched the interaction, her heart swelling with respect and love for the woman who had shaped so much of their lives. "Can we keep some of her things in my room?" Amber asked hesitantly. "Of course we can," William said, his voice thick with emotion. "Actually, I was thinking of turning this room into something special." "Like what?" Keisha and Amber asked, almost in unison. "A memorial," William said thoughtfully. "A place where we can come whenever we want to feel her presence, with her photos, her shells, her favorite books." "And new things too," Amber added, his voice gaining confidence. "Like photos of us, so she can see how happy we are." William's eyes glistened as he nodded. "That's a perfect idea, son." That afternoon, the three of them worked together, transforming the room, not to erase Selina's memory, but to celebrate her life in a way that brought them closer together. Among her belongings, Keisha found an old diary. With William's permission, she opened it and read a few pages aloud to Amber. "She wrote about you every day," Keisha told him, her voice warm. "Listen to this. Today, my little sailor decided that 3 a.m. was the perfect time to practice swimming. William says he'll be an Olympic athlete, but I think he'll explore the ocean one day." Amber giggled, his laughter filling the room with life once more. William Garrett often joked that Amber might one day swim for the Olympics, but he was certain his son would grow up to be an explorer of the ocean. Amber giggled at the memory, his bright eyes lighting up. He was right. I love the sea. As they sifted through old photographs later that evening, they came across one that made both of them pause. It captured Selina, William's late wife, dancing in the rain on a joyous day, her face tilted toward the sky, radiant and full of life. "That was taken on our wedding day," William explained, his voice tinged with both fondness and sorrow. "It started raining during the reception, but instead of being upset, Selina dragged everyone outside to dance in the garden. She had a way of turning even the most ordinary moments into something magical." Keisha smiled as she imagined the scene. "She must have been incredible," she said softly. Amber, standing nearby, wrapped his small arms around her waist. "Like you," he added earnestly. Keisha's eyes welled with tears as she kissed the top of his head. Later that night, after Amber had drifted off to sleep, William found Keisha standing on the balcony. She gazed up at the stars, her expression thoughtful and serene. He approached quietly. "What's on your mind?" he asked. She didn't turn to face him, but answered in a gentle voice. "I'm thinking about how love isn't just one thing. It takes so many forms, and how, even as we hold on to the past, we can still build a future." William placed a hand on her shoulder, drawing her closer. As their fingers intertwined, the engagement ring he had given her pressed lightly against his palm. "Do you know what Selina wrote in her final journal entry?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Keisha shook her head. "No. Tell me." She wrote, "True love is like the ocean. It isn't possessive, it's infinite. It holds every current, every tide, and every life that passes through it." Keisha's gaze dropped to their joined hands, and a quiet smile formed on her lips. "She was wise," she whispered. "Yes, she was," William agreed. He hesitated before adding, "And I think she would have been happy to see us finding our own tide." Before going to bed that night, Amber asked to look through the family photo album again. On the last page, he carefully placed a drawing he'd made earlier in the day. It showed their new family, William, Keisha, and Amber, with Selina watching over them from a golden glow in the sky. "Now it's finished," Amber declared proudly, closing the album with a satisfied smile. William and Keisha exchanged a glance, their eyes filled with emotion. "Yes," William said quietly, "it's complete." Not because Selina had been replaced, her memory was irreplaceable, but because they had learned that love could grow and create new spaces without diminishing the old. Somewhere, he believed, Selina was smiling, knowing her family had found not just peace, but a new kind of happiness. The morning of the wedding dawned with a crisp clarity, the kind that made the air feel alive. The Garrett estate had been transformed into an elegant yet intimate setting. The ceremony was to be held in the conservatory, where white and blue flowers lined the space, evoking the tranquil beauty of the ocean. Upstairs, Keisha was preparing in a guest room, temporarily turned bridal suite. Margaret, ever efficient, adjusted the final details of Keisha's dress, a simple ivory gown with delicate wave-like embroidery. "It's missing something," Margaret muttered, tilting her head. At that moment, Amber appeared at the doorway, dressed sharply in a tiny tuxedo and clutching an old wooden box. "Dad told me to give you this," he said, stepping forward with a shy grin. Keisha opened the box to find a pearl necklace and a note written in William's careful hand. "Dear Keisha, Selina wore these pearls at our wedding. She said they were special because Like true love, they take time, patience, and adversity to form. Today, they belong to you, not to replace memories, but to create new ones. With love, William. Tears threatened to spill as Keisha read the words. Margaret quickly handed her a tissue, her voice unsteady. "Let me help you with the necklace," she offered, her hands trembling slightly. Amber beamed as he watched Keisha. "You look beautiful," he said matter-of-factly. "Like a mermaid." Keisha knelt to his level, carefully holding her dress. "And you look like a real prince," she replied, cupping his cheek. "Can I tell you a secret?" Amber nodded eagerly, leaning closer. "I dreamed about Mum last night," he whispered. Keisha's breath hitched. "You did?" "She said she's happy," Amber continued, his voice soft but sure. "She said she'll never be alone now, and she asked me to thank you for taking care of Dad's heart." In the conservatory, William stood waiting, his nerves masked by a calm demeanor. The judge was in place, and the few close friends and family who had been invited settled into their seats. A gentle melody began, inspired by the ocean's rhythms rather than traditional wedding marches. Amber entered first, carrying the rings with solemn pride. But all eyes turned when Keisha appeared. William's breath caught as he saw the pearl necklace resting around her neck. It was as if Selina herself had placed a blessing on this union, affirming it as part of their family's journey. Later, as the reception unfolded in the lush garden, a soft drizzle began to fall. Instead of retreating indoors, William and Keisha exchanged knowing smiles. "Looks like someone wants us to dance in the rain," William said, extending his hand toward Keisha. She laughed softly as the band played a gentle melody, and the two began to sway together under the light raindrops. Soon, the guests joined in, their laughter and movements filling the garden with a rare and beautiful kind of magic. As night fell over the Garrett home, its shadows seemed to melt away, replaced by warmth and light. It had become more than a house. It was a sanctuary where love, in all its shapes and colors, was allowed to thrive. In Selina's memorial room, a light breeze drifted through the curtains, gently setting the seashell wind chime into motion. The soft sound echoed like a final blessing for the family, a reminder that love, in all its forms, endures forever. If you could write a letter to be placed in the memorial room like the Garrett family did for Selina, what memories or unspoken thoughts would you preserve for someone special? Share your reflections in the comments below. Thank you for joining us for this story. If it touched your heart, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your thoughts mean the world to us. Until next time.